Hello, and welcome. I'm glad you could join me. It's comforting, isn't it? This small, glowing screen in the darkness, a tiny window of light in your own quiet space. If you're watching this late at night, or perhaps in the strange blue hours of early morning where you are, you're safe. You can pause this, you can turn on the lights, you can check that the doors are locked. But the Gruber family, they weren't safe. For them, the locked doors didn't matter. The evil was already inside. Before we descend into the shadows of what happened on their remote Bavarian farmstead, please consider subscribing to this channel. It helps us continue to explore these dark corners of history, and it ensures you won't miss our next journey into the unexplained. By joining us, you become part of a community that understands that the most terrifying stories are the ones that are true. And the story of Hinterkaifeck is one of the truest and most terrifying of them all. Imagine a place, not a grand Gothic castle or a haunted asylum, but a simple, work-worn farm. A collection of stone and timber buildings huddled together against the vast, indifferent emptiness of the German countryside. The name of this place was Hinterkaifeck, a name that, even now, a century later, is spoken in hushed tones in the villages that surround the empty field where it once stood. The name means, roughly, behind the wooded hill. It's a name that speaks of isolation, of being set apart, hidden from view. And in the late winter of 1922, this isolation became a tomb. 6 people lived on that farm. An old man, his wife, their widowed daughter, her 2 young children, and a brand new maid who had the profound misfortune of arriving on the very day that death was waiting. They were a family, with all the complexities, secrets, and quiet resentments that entails. And then, one by one, they were extinguished. No, tied with a gunshot that might have alerted a distant neighbor, but with the brutal, intimate swing of a common farm tool, a pickaxe, or a mattock, depending on the report. The distinction hardly matters to the dead. What matters, what chills the very marrow of the bone, is what happened next. After the slaughter, the killer did not flee. They stayed. For days, they lived in the house, surrounded by the silence of the 6 bodies they had hidden in the barn. They tended the cattle. They fed the dog. They cooked meals for themselves in the family's kitchen. They slept in one of their beds. They moved through the silent farmhouse like a ghost, a caretaker of the dead, until the outside world finally noticed something was terribly wrong. This is the central horrifying question of Hinterkaifeck. It is not just who did this, but why, and how. How could a person or persons commit such an act of intimate, furious violence and then calmly inhabit the life of their victims? How could evil be so methodical, so patient, so utterly at home in the aftermath of its own atrocity? This is the story of a silence that fell over a small farm. A silence so deep and so absolute that it has echoed for 100 years. And a mystery so profound that it remains, to this day, utterly, terrifyingly, unsolved. We are going to walk the grounds of that vanished farm. We are going to listen to the whispers in the trees. We are going to try and understand the darkness that gathered at Hinterkaifeck, a darkness that was not supernatural but terrifyingly human. To understand the horror of Hinterkaifeck, you must first understand the isolation. Not just the physical distance from one village to the next, but the deep, psychological isolation that defined life in rural Bavaria in the years following the Great War. Germany was a wounded nation, haunted by the ghosts of its fallen sons, wrestling with economic collapse and a profound sense of national humiliation. In the bustling cities, political chaos brewed, but out in the countryside, life was dictated by older, slower rhythms. The turn of the seasons, the price of grain, the health of the livestock. It was a world of hard work, deep-seated tradition, and long memories. Grudges could be nursed for a generation. Secrets could be buried under layers of stubborn silence. The farmstead known as Hinterkaifeck was an island within this already isolated world. It was located about a kilometer from the main village of Kaifeck, which itself was little more than a cluster of houses. To get there, you had to walk through a dense patch of woods, a journey that, on a dark or snowy night, would have felt like a passage into another realm. The farm was not a place you happened upon by accident. You had to have a reason to go there. And in the spring of 1922, fewer and fewer people had a reason. The heart of this isolated kingdom was the Gruber family, and at its head was the patriarch, Andreas Gruber. He was 63 years old, a man hardened by decades of relentless farm labor. Neighbors described him as cantankerous, stingy, and quick to anger. He was not a popular man. He was known for his sharp business dealings and a simmering distrust of almost everyone. He was the kind of man who would count his tools every night, not out of neatness, but out of a deep-seated conviction that the world was full of thieves. His physical presence was imposing, his demeanor unwelcoming. He kept to himself, and he expected his family to do the same. His wife, Kazilia, who was 72, was a more sympathetic but equally remote figure. She was described as devoutly religious, a woman who found her solace in prayer, perhaps because there was little to be found within the walls of her own home. She was physically frail, worn down by a life of hard work, and, one can only imagine, the difficult nature of her husband. She was a ghost in her own life, a silent, praying presence moving through the cold rooms of the farmhouse. The emotional core of the family, and the center of much of the mystery, was their widowed daughter, Victoria Gabriel. At 35, she was a woman caught between worlds. Her husband, Karl Gabriel, had been reported killed in the trenches of France during the war, leaving her a young widow with a small daughter. Yet, she remained under her father's roof, a subject of his domineering will. Victoria was known to be a private, somewhat melancholic woman, but she was also known for her musical talent. She sang in the local church choir, one of her few connections to the outside world. This connection, however, was fraught with tension. Because within the suffocating confines of Hinterkaifeck, a dark and persistent rumor had taken root, a rumor that poisoned the Gruber family's relationship with the surrounding community. It was whispered in the village, behind cupped hands and averted eyes, that Andreas Gruber's relationship with his own daughter Victoria was unnatural, that it was incestuous. This wasn't just idle gossip. The rumors had been so strong that Andreas and Victoria had been convicted of the crime in court years earlier. Though they had served their sentences, the stain of the accusation never faded. It clung to them, marking them as outcasts, as people who lived outside the bounds of both God's and man's law. This secret, this transgression, was the true wall that surrounded Hinterkaifeck, more formidable than any forest or field. Living within this charged and secretive atmosphere were two children. The first was Victoria's daughter, Kazilia, named after her grandmother. She was 7 years old, a schoolgirl, a bright spark in a grim household. She was, by all accounts, a beloved child, but one who was growing up in the shadow of the family's dark reputation. She was the family's most frequent link to the outside world, walking the lonely path to the school in the nearby town of Weidhofen. She was a child who must have sensed the tension, the unspoken secrets that hung in the air like smoke. The second child was a toddler, little Joseph, just 2 years old. He was born in 1919, long after Victoria's husband had supposedly died in the war. His paternity was the family's other great, open secret. While Victoria claimed a local man, Lorenz Schlittenbauer, was the father. The rumors persisted that Joseph was the product of her ongoing incestuous relationship with her own father, Andreas. The child was a living symbol of the family's sin, a constant reminder of their isolation and the judgment of their neighbors. He was a baby born into a world of whispers. The farm itself was a character in this tragedy. It was a typical Bavarian farmstead of the era, a self-contained unit where the lines between living and working were blurred. The main house, the cattle barn, the stables, and a shed for machinery were all connected or clustered tightly together. One could move from the warmth of the kitchen to the cold, animal-smelling darkness of the barn without ever truly stepping outside. This layout, designed for efficiency in the harsh winters, created a labyrinthine, enclosed world. It was a place of deep shadows and strange acoustics, where the groan of timber could sound like a footstep, and the rustle of hay could be mistaken for a whisper. The attic, a vast dark space filled with stored hay and forgot. 10 objects stretched over both the living quarters and the barn. It was a perfect hiding place, a shadowy observer's gallery overlooking the life of the family below. The engine shed housed a small motor used to chop feed, a noisy, clattering machine that, on the night of the murders, may have played a crucial, sinister role. The entire property was powered by the rhythms of animal life. The lowing of cattle, the clucking of chickens, the barking of the family dog. These were the sounds of Hinterkaifeck, sounds that would, for several days, become a strange and lonely testament to an unspeakable crime. Into this isolated, tense, and secretive world, a final character arrived on the afternoon of Friday, March 31st, 1922. Her name was Maria Baumgartner. She was the new maid, hired to replace the previous one who had quit suddenly 6 months prior. The former maid had left in a state of terror, claiming the house was haunted. She spoke of hearing footsteps in the empty attic, of disembodied voices, of a feeling of being constantly watched by an unseen presence. Her stories were dismissed by the pragmatic and cynical Andreas Gruber as the fantasies of a superstitious girl. But they hung in the air, a premonition of the horror to come. Maria Baumgartner, a 44-year-old woman seeking stable employment, likely knew nothing of these stories. She arrived with her small suitcase, ready to begin her new life. She had no way of knowing that her life at Hinterkaifeck would last only a few hours. She was walking into a place where the dread had already begun to curdle, a place where a predator was already circling, perhaps even watching from the darkness of the woods as she made her way up the path to the farmhouse for the first and last time. The farm was unsettled. A feeling of wrongness had already taken root, long before the first swing of the pickaxe. The Grubers were not Judite, isolated from their neighbors. They were unknowingly sharing their isolated world with something malevolent, something that was watching, listening, and waiting. Fear is a gradual thing. It rarely arrives like a thunderclap. More often, it seeps in like a fog, starting at the edges of your perception. A sound you can't quite place. A shadow that moves too quickly in your peripheral vision. A feeling of being watched when you are, by all logic, completely alone. For the Gruber family, in the cold, bleak days of late March 1922, the fog of fear was beginning to roll in. They were practical, hard-working people, not given to flights of fancy. But a series of small, inexplicable events began to prick at the edges of their stoic reality, creating a tapestry of rising dread. The narrative of these final days comes to us primarily from Andreas Gruber himself, who, in a rare break from his usual taciturn nature, confided his growing unease to his neighbors. It's as if some primal instinct was compelling him to reach out, to breach the walls of his self-imposed isolation, even as the threat drew closer. It began, as so many chilling tales do, with footprints in the snow. Several days before the murders, after a fresh snowfall had blanketed the countryside in a pristine white silence, Andreas Gruber went out to inspect his property. There, leading out of the dense woods at the edge of his land, he found a single set of footprints. They were clear and deep in the fresh snow. They led directly towards the farmhouse. A stranger had come calling in the night. But when Andreas followed the tracks, a cold knot of confusion must have tightened in his stomach. The footprints led to the house, to the machine shed to be precise. But there were no corresponding tracks leading away. It was as if a man had walked out of the forest, approached the farm, and then simply vanished into thin air. He searched the entire property, circling the barn, the house, the stables. There was no second set of tracks, no path of retreat. The visitor, whoever they were, had come from the woods and had not left. The only logical yet terrifying conclusion was that they were still there, somewhere on the farm, hiding, waiting. This discovery would have been deeply unsettling for any homeowner, but for a man like Andreas Gruber, a man who valued his privacy and security above all else, it would have been a profound violation. His small, isolated kingdom had been breached. He told neighbors about it, his words laced with a mixture of anger and a confusion he couldn't quite conceal. He likely spent that night listening, his ears straining to catch any unfamiliar sound over the familiar groans of the old house and the soft breathing of the cattle in the barn. Did he sleep at all? Or did he lie awake, picturing the unseen intruder moving silently through the shadows of his property, a phantom who left only a one-way trail in the snow? The silence of the house would no longer have been comforting. It would have been menacing, filled with the possibility of a hidden presence. The next incident was even more personal, more invasive. A few nights later, the family was jolted from their sleep by sounds coming from the attic. They were not the usual creaks and groans of an old farmhouse settling. These were distinct human sounds. Footsteps. A heavy shuffling tread, moving back and forth in the darkness directly above their heads. The attic was a vast hay-filled space that stretched over the main living quarters and the barn. It was accessible by a ladder from the feeding passage in the barn, a place of deep shadows and dust. Andreas, likely armed with a lantern and perhaps a pitchfork, went to investigate. He was a man who would not have tolerated intruders. He climbed into the dark, cavernous space, the lantern light casting long, dancing shadows. He searched everywhere, through the mountains of hay, in every dark corner. He found naught, no one. The attic was empty, and yet the family had all heard it. The previous maid stories of a haunted attic, once dismissed as foolishness, must have echoed in their minds. But this wasn't a ghost. Ghosts don't leave footprints in the snow. This was something tangible, something real, and it was living in their house, right above their heads, an unseen tenant in the dark. The psychological pressure was mounting. The sanctuary of their home had been compromised, transformed into a place of uncertainty and fear. The feeling of being watched, of not being alone, would have been constant. Every creak of a floorboard, every gust of wind rattling a window pane, would have been amplified, analyzed for intent. The family was living in a state of low-grade, constant siege. Then came another strange discovery. Lying on the ground near the house, Andreas found a newspaper. This was not their newspaper. It was from Munich, a city miles away. No one in the family had been to Munich. No one they knew had visited from there. It was a foreign object, a piece of the outside world that had appeared from nowhere, like a message from an unknown sender. Who had dropped it? Was it the same person who had left the footprints? The one who walked in their attic? The newspaper was another piece of the puzzle that made no sense, another thread in the growing web of the uncanny. It suggested an intruder who was not just a local vagrant, but someone from further afield, someone with a purpose that remained terrifyingly obscure. The final and perhaps most ominous event occurred on the morning of Friday, March 31st, the very day the new maid, Maria Baumgartner, was due to arrive. Andreas went to check the tool shed and discovered that a set of house keys was missing. They had been there the day before. Now they were gone. This was the most chilling development of all. The footprints showed an intruder could get onto the property. The noises in the attic suggested the intruder could get into the buildings. But the missing keys meant the intruder now had free access to the heart of the home, the locked living quarters. They could come and go as they pleased. They no longer needed to hide in the attic or the barn. They could walk through the front door. The thin veneer of security that a locked door provides was now gone. The family was completely vulnerable. Andreas confided this last, terrifying detail to a neighbor that morning. He seemed agitated, on edge. He spoke of his intention to go to the nearby town of Schrobenhausen, but for some reason, he never went. Did he feel he couldn't leave his family unprotected? Did some gut instinct tell him that the climax of these strange events was fast approaching? That afternoon, Maria Baumgartner arrived, escorted by her sister. They saw Victoria and her daughter Casilia in the kitchen. They exchanged pleasantries. Maria's sister then departed, leaving Maria to settle into her new room. This was the last time any member of the Gruber family, or their new maid, was seen alive by an outside witness. As evening fell on March 31, 1922, the farm of Hinterkaifeck was a pressure cooker of fear and secrets. Inside, a family was trapped with a growing dread they couldn't name. Outside, or perhaps inside, a presence was watching, holding their house keys, in possession of a newspaper from a distant city. A presence that had been living alongside them for days. A patient predator that had studied their routines, learned the layout of their home, and was now ready to make its final move. The sun set, the lamps were lit, and the deep dark silence of the Bavarian night descended upon the farm. It was a silence that was about to be broken by an act of unimaginable violence. The days of strange portents were over. The night of horror was about to begin. The darkness that fell over Hinterkaifeck on the evening of Friday, March 31st, was more than just the absence of light. It was an active, encroaching presence. The farm, already an island of isolation, was now completely cut off, adrift in a sea of rural night. Inside the main house, the family would have been going through their evening routines, but the familiar actions must have been underscored by a new and terrible tension. The knowledge that someone had been in their attic, that their keys were missing, would have poisoned the very air they breathed. Every shadow would seem deeper, every sound more menacing. The killer at this point was no longer a vague threat. He, or they, was a known entity, a phantom who had made his presence felt for days. The question was no longer if he would act, but when and how. The reconstruction of that night is a mosaic of forensic evidence and chilling speculation, a step-by-step descent into a meticulously planned and brutally executed slaughter. The killer's strategy was one of chilling patience and psychological manipulation, luring his victims to their doom, one by one. The attack likely began in the late evening. The stage for the massacre was the barn, a place of deep shadows, the smell of hay and livestock, and the cold, damp air of a late winter's night. The first to be lured out of the relative safety of the house was probably the 35-year-old Victoria Gabriel. Why her? Perhaps she was the focal point of the killer's rage, or perhaps she was simply the easiest to draw out. The killer may have made a noise in the barn, a disturbance among the cattle, the sound of a falling tool, something that would require investigation. Victoria, being younger and more able-bodied than her elderly parents, would have been the logical one to go and check. She would have taken a lantern, its single flame cutting a small, flickering circle of light in the immense darkness. As she stepped from the feeding passage into the main part of the barn, she would have been completely vulnerable. The killer was waiting in the shadows, armed with the murder weapon, a pickaxe or mattock, taken from the Gruber's own tool shed. The attack would have been sudden, ferocious, and silent. There was likely no time to scream. The first blow, aimed at the head, would have been instantly incapacitating. The subsequent blows were acts of pure, unrestrained fury. With Victoria dead or dying in the hay-strewn darkness of the barn, the killer waited. He knew the family's habits. He knew that when Victoria didn't return, someone else would come looking for her. The next to emerge from the house was the elderly Casilia Gruber, Victoria's mother. She may have called out her daughter's name, her voice swallowed by the vast silence of the farm. Hearing no reply, she too would have entered the barn, perhaps following the same path her daughter had taken just moments before. In the dim, uncertain light, she may not have even seen Victoria's body before the killer struck again from the shadows. The same brutal, overwhelming violence. Another life extinguished in the cold darkness of the barn. 2 members of the family were now dead, their bodies lying only feet apart, and the killer's work was not even half done. The patriarch, Andreas Gruber, would have been next. Hearing the continued silence from the barn, his wife and daughter now both missing, the stubborn, suspicious old man would have gone to investigate himself. He was not a man easily intimidated, but even he must have felt a surge of adrenaline, a sense of profound wrongness. He entered the barn, the place he knew better than any other on earth, and walked into the same ambush. The killer, likely hidden behind a stack of hay or a piece of machinery, would have had the element of complete surprise. Andreas, for all his physical strength and domineering presence, was an old man. He stood no chance. He was struck down with the same terrifying ferocity as his wife and daughter. The head of the household, the king of this small, isolated kingdom, was now dead. The killer had systematically dismantled the family's authority structure, eliminating the adults one by one. Now only the children remained. And it is here that the horror reaches an almost unbearable pitch. The killer, his hands and weapons stained with the blood of 3 people, needed to eliminate the last witness in the barn. 7-year-old Kazelia. The little girl had almost certainly followed her grandfather into the barn. Perhaps she was scared to be left alone in the house. Perhaps she was looking for her mother. What she saw in that barn is the stuff of nightmares. In the flickering lamplight, she would have seen the bodies of her mother, her grandmother, and her grandfather. She would have seen the killer. The forensic evidence suggests she was not killed instantly. There were signs that she had torn out her own hair in clumps, an act of unimaginable terror and distress. She witnessed the slaughter of her entire family before the killer turned the pickaxe on her. A 7-year-old child, murdered in a dark barn amidst the bodies of her loved ones. It is a detail of such profound cruelty that it almost defies comprehension. The main house was now empty, save for 2 people. The new maid, Maria Baumgartner, and the 2-year-old baby, Josef. The killer, his bloody work in the barn complete, now moved with cold, calculated purpose back towards the house. He was no longer an outsider. He was the master of Hinterkaifeck. He walked through the connecting passages, leaving the 4 bodies behind in the hay, and entered the living quarters. His first target was the new maid, Maria Baumgartner. She had been at the farm for only a few hours. She was in her small bedroom, perhaps asleep, perhaps lying awake and listening to the strange, terrifying sounds from outside. The killer entered her room and killed her in her bed. The attack was just as brutal as the others. She had no chance to defend herself, no chance to escape. She was a stranger in this house, a woman who had come seeking a new beginning, only to find the most violent and horrific of ends. Her only crime was being in the wrong place at the very worst time. 5 people were now dead. Only 1 remained. The baby, Joseph, asleep in his cot in his mother Victoria's bedroom. The killer walked into the room, the pickaxe still in his hand. He stood over the sleeping child. What could possibly be the thought process of a person at this moment? To have murdered 5 people, including a 7-year-old child, and then to be faced with a helpless infant. There was no mercy. The killer raised the weapon one last time and brought it down on the 2-year-old boy. The slaughter was complete. 6 people, 3 generations of a single family, and their newly arrived maid, were dead. The entire population of Hinterkaifeck had been wiped out. The house, which moments before had held the life and breath of 6 individuals, was now utterly, deathly silent. But the killer's night was not over. In an act that elevates this crime from a simple massacre to a case of profound psychological horror, he did not flee. He dragged the 4 bodies from the barn into a more concealed area, covering them with hay and a broken door. He may have moved the bodies of the maid and the baby as well, or left them where they fell. Then, he washed his hands. He went into the kitchen. He likely found food and ate a meal. He stoked the fire to keep warm. He walked through the rooms of the house, now his own. He went to the barn and tended to the livestock. The cows needed to be milked, the other animals fed, and he did it. He stepped into the role of the farmer he had just murdered. The dog, which had been barking, was now quiet. Was it killed, or was it simply familiar with the killer, recognizing his scent or his voice? This is one of the case's most chilling and debated questions. For the next 3 days, this phantom would inhabit the farm. He lived there, with the bodies of his 6 victims hidden just yards away. He was the sole living human being at Hinterkaifeck, a king ruling over an empire of the dead. The silence that followed the murders was not the silence of an empty house. It was the silence of a house occupied by a monster. The world keeps turning, even when a small corner of it has fallen into an abyss of horror. For the neighbors and villagers around Hinterkaifeck, Saturday, April 1st, was just another day. Life went on. But the absence of the Grubers began to register in small, subtle ways. It started with the mail. The postman, Joseph Meyer, arrived at the farm on Saturday afternoon to deliver the mail, as he always did. He called out, but there was no answer. The farm was strangely quiet. He lingered for a moment, perhaps puzzled by the silence, but not yet alarmed. The Grubers were known for being private and unsociable. He left the mail and continued on his route. Then came Sunday. The Grubers were conspicuously absent from church. Victoria, with her place in the choir, was a regular attendee. Her absence was noted. Cecilia Sr., the devout grandmother, was also missing. It was unusual, a break in the rigid routine that governed their lives. The whispers of concern would have started then, quiet questions in the churchyard. Where were the Grubers? By Monday, the concern had deepened. 7-year-old Cecilia did not show up for school. She was a good student who rarely missed a day. Her unexplained absence was another red flag, another sign that something was amiss at the isolated farmstead. The small, disconnected pieces of information began to coalesce into a larger picture of wrongness. The mailman's report of silence, the absence from church, the empty desk at school. The community, which had kept the Grubers at arm's length due to the dark rumors surrounding them, now began to feel a prickle of responsibility, or perhaps just morbid curiosity. The silence from Hinterkaifeck was becoming too loud to ignore. The task of investigating fell to their nearest neighbor, the aforementioned Lorenz Schlittenbauer. His relationship with the family was complicated. He was a former lover of Victoria's, and the man she had named as the father of her baby, Josef. He was also a man who had had disputes with the stubborn Andreas Gruber. On Tuesday, April 4th, 4 full days after the murders, Schlittenbauer decided to act. He gathered a couple of other men, and together they made their way to the farm. The scene they found was one of profound and eerie stillness. The farm looked normal, but it felt dead. The dog barked from inside the barn, a lonely, anxious sound. They called out the family's names. Andreas! Victoria! The only reply was the wind and the restless barking of the dog. They circled the property, trying doors and peering into windows. Everything was locked up tight. The house was impenetrable. Their unease grew with every silent locked door. Finally, they made their way to the machine shed. Schlittenbauer, familiar with the property, managed to slide open a door. They stepped inside, into the gloom. The first thing they noticed was the smell, the faint, sweet, coppery scent of blood. It hung in the still air, a scent that every farmer knows and dreads. They moved from the shed into the main barn. The dog, tied up inside, greeted them with frantic barks. And it was there, in the semi-darkness of the barn, that I made the first horrific discovery. Someone noticed a disturbance in the hay. A pile of it seemed unnaturally heaped. Poking at it, they uncovered the edge of an old door used to cover something. With a growing sense of dread, they pulled the door away. Beneath it, covered by more hay and a woman's dress, was a pile of bodies. It was an image of pure carnage, a tableau of slaughter that would be seared into their minds forever. The bodies of Andreas Gruber, his wife Kazelia, their daughter Victoria, and the little girl, Kazelia, were heaped together. They had been killed with unimaginable violence, their heads crushed by heavy, repeated blows. They were positioned in a strange, almost layered way, as if the killer had stacked them there. The blood had soaked into the hay and the wooden floorboards, creating a dark, sticky morass. The men, simple farmers accustomed to the cycles of life and death in nature, were confronted with something entirely different. This was not nature. This was an act of monstrous human evil. The shock and horror of the discovery were so profound that for a moment, they likely forgot that two members of the household were still unaccounted for. Leaving the gruesome scene in the barn, they finally gained access to the house itself. The interior of the house presented a second, and in some ways, more disturbing mystery. The beds were made. In one of them, it looked as if someone had recently slept. In the kitchen, there were plates with the remains of a recent meal. Meat had been carved from the pantry, and bread had been cut. The fire had been tended. The house did not feel abandoned. It felt recently lived in. It was here, in the quiet, orderly rooms of the house, that they found the last two victims. The new maid, Maria Baumgartner, was dead in her bedchamber. The baby, Josef, was dead in his cot in his mother's room. Both had suffered the same horrific head injuries as the others. The entire family was accounted for. 6 bodies. The population of Hinterkaifeck reduced to 0. The true mind-bending horror of the situation began to dawn on Schlittenbauer and the other men. The killer had not just murdered the family and fled. The evidence was all around them. Someone had been living in this house of the dead. For the past 3 days, while the village wondered where the Grubers were, the killer had been here. He had slept in their beds, eaten their food, and walked through their silent rooms. He had gone out to the barn, stepping past the hidden bodies of his victims, to milk the cows and feed the cattle. He had cared for the dog. He had inhabited the life of the people he had just slaughtered. This was not a crime of passion that ended in a panicked flight. It was not a robbery gone wrong. No money had been taken, despite the family having a considerable amount of cash in the house. This was something else entirely. It was an act of possession. The killer had not just taken their lives, he had taken their home, their existence. He had stayed until, for reasons we will never know, he decided it was time to leave, locking the doors behind him and melting back into the world, leaving behind a silent farm, 6 brutalized bodies, and a mystery that would defy all explanation. The discovery at Hinterkaifeck was not just the discovery of a murder. It was the discovery of a void, a place where all logic and human decency had ceased to exist. The arrival of the Munich Police Department the following day, on Wednesday, April 5th, marked the official beginning of an investigation that was, in many ways, doomed from the start. The crime that had been committed at Hinterkaifeck was so bizarre, so outside the normal realm of human behavior, that the investigators were immediately at a disadvantage. They were confronted not with a simple, understandable motive like robbery or revenge, but with a scene of almost ritualistic slaughter followed by a period of inexplicable domesticity. The initial hours and days of the investigation were a chaotic whirlwind of activity that, unfortunately, did more to obscure the truth than to reveal it. The first major problem was the contamination of the crime scene. By the time the professional investigators from Munich arrived, the farm had been overrun. Neighbors, villagers, and local officials had all walked through the property. They had moved objects, touched surfaces, and tracked mud and debris through the house and barn. In an era before the meticulous science of forensics as we know it today, the concept of preserving a crime scene was rudimentary at best. Dozens of people had gawked at the bodies, disturbed the layout of the rooms, and inadvertently destroyed what little physical evidence the killer might have left behind. Any potential fingerprints were smudged, any unique footprints were trampled. The killer's phantom-like presence was made even more ephemeral by the well-intentioned but ultimately destructive curiosity of the local community. It was as if the crime scene itself was a text, and everyone had smudged the ink before the experts had a chance to read it. The autopsies were conducted on site, a grim and macabre affair performed right there on the barn floor, only feet from where the victims had been discovered. The local doctor, Johann Baptist Aumüller, ex-Thalmaum, mined the bodies one by one. The cause of death was brutally obvious: massive blunt force trauma to the head, delivered by a heavy pointed instrument consistent with a pickaxe. The skulls were crushed. The level of violence was extreme, suggesting a personal frenzied rage. Yet, this rage was contradicted by the cold calculation of the killer's subsequent actions. It was a maddening paradox. One of the most bizarre and tragic decisions made during the investigation was the removal of the victims' heads. Believing that a more thorough examination in a proper laboratory in Munich might yield further clues, the 6 skulls were severed from the bodies and sent away. The headless corpses of the Gruber family were then buried in the cemetery in Weidhofen. The heads, however, would never be returned. They were examined by various clairvoyants and psychics in the years that followed, a testament to the desperation of the investigators, but yielded no useful information. In the chaos of World War II, the 6 skulls were lost, and their final resting place remains unknown to this day. This strange, unsettling detail adds another layer of incompletion to the story, a physical manifestation of the unresolved nature of the case itself. The family remains, in a very literal sense, incomplete. As the investigators pieced together the timeline, the evidence of the killer's extended stay became the central, most baffling feature of the crime. They confirmed what the neighbors had discovered. The cattle had been fed and milked. The dog had been cared for. Food had been prepared and eaten in the kitchen. Someone had been stoking the fire in the stove to keep the house warm. They had even, it seemed, released a tethered bull from the barn. This wasn't the behavior of a frantic killer trying to cover his tracks. This was the behavior of someone who was, for a few days, comfortable. At me. He was a usurper, a changeling who had stepped into the life of Andreas Gruber after ending it. The police were forced to consider a suspect who was not only a brutal murderer, but also a competent farmer. This narrowed the field in one sense, but opened up a host of terrifying new questions. Was this someone local, someone who knew the family and their routines? Or was it a wandering farmhand, a drifter with a working knowledge of agriculture and a heart full of malice? The police pursued several lines of inquiry, each leading to a frustrating dead end. The initial theory, common in such rural crimes, was that of a robbery gone wrong. But this was quickly dismissed. A significant amount of money in cash and gold coins was found untouched in the house. Valuables were not taken. Robbery was clearly not the motive. They considered the possibility of a political motive, a fringe theory in the turbulent atmosphere of post-war Germany. But there was no evidence to suggest the Grubers had any political affiliations that would mark them for assassination. They looked at vagrants, drifters, and escaped mental patients, interviewing hundreds of people in the surrounding areas. But no credible suspect emerged. Every lead seemed to evaporate. Every trail went cold. The killer had left behind a scene of unimaginable carnage, but he had taken his identity with him, leaving almost no trace. The few clues they did have were maddeningly vague. The murder weapon was determined to be a mattock, a type of pickaxe, belonging to the Grubers themselves. The killer had used the family's own tool to slaughter them. This suggested a certain degree of premeditation, of familiarity with the farm. He knew where the tools were kept. The discovery of the Munich newspaper also pointed towards an outsider, someone with connections to the city. But it was a common paper with a wide circulation. It was a clue that led everywhere and nowhere at once. The reports from Andreas Gruber in the days beat something. For his death, the footprints, the noises in the attic, the missing keys, were now re-examined as the chilling prelude to the crime. The police had to accept the almost unbelievable premise that the killer had been living on the farm, secretly, for several days before the murders. He had been hiding in the attic or the barn, observing the family, learning their rhythms, waiting for the perfect moment to strike. This level of patience and audacity was almost unheard of. It painted a portrait of a killer who was not just violent, but unnervingly confident and methodical. He had made the farm his hunting ground before he made it his home. The investigation was no longer just a search for a murderer. It was a search for a ghost who had, for a brief, terrible period, taken on flesh and blood. The police were left with a series of contradictions, a crime of furious passion and cold logic, a killer who was both a frenzied butcher and a diligent farmhand, a phantom who had lived among his victims before and after he killed them. The farm of Hinterkaifeck had become a black hole, swallowing all attempts at rational explanation. In the vacuum of hard evidence, suspicion and theory bloom like weeds in a neglected garden. The Hinterkaifeck case, with its dearth of clues and surplus of strangeness, became fertile ground for speculation. The police and the community turned their gaze upon the people who had orbited the Gruber family's dark star, searching for a motive powerful enough to explain the slaughter of 6 people, including 2 small children. Over the years, a handful of key suspects emerged, each with a story, a potential motive, and a cloud of suspicion that would follow them for the rest of their lives. Yet, for every theory that seemed plausible, there were contradictions and unanswered questions that kept the truth just out of reach. The most prominent and enduring suspect was the neighbor, Lorenz Schlittenbauer. His connection to the family was intimate and fraught with conflict. He had been Victoria's lover and was the presumed father of little Joseph, a claim he sometimes acknowledged and sometimes denied. He had a clear, tangible link to the emotional heart of the household. His motive, theorists proposed, was a tangled knot of love, jealousy, and financial dispute. Perhaps he and Victoria had argued. Perhaps she had threatened to reveal him as Joseph's father conclusively, which could have had financial implications. Or, in a darker scenario, perhaps Schlittenbauer discovered the horrifying truth of the incest between Victoria and her father, Andreas, and flew into a jealous rage. His actions on the day the bodies were discovered were also seen as highly suspicious. As one of the first people on the scene, he seemed unusually calm and handled the bodies with a strange familiarity, disturbing the crime scene in the process. Some accounts claim he spoke to one of the bodies, saying something to the effect of, "I've done this for you." Years later, deathbed confessions were attributed to him, with local priests and villagers claiming he admitted to the crime in his final hours. But these are unverified, second-hand accounts, the stuff of local legend. The case against Schlittenbauer is compelling but circumstantial. Could one man, even in a rage, have overpowered the strong Andreas Gruber and systematically murdered 6 people? And if his rage was directed at Victoria or Andreas, why murder everyone, including the baby he may have believed was his own son? And why would he then stay to tend the farm? His behavior was strange, but strangeness is not proof of murder. The cloud of suspicion followed him to his grave, but the case against him was never solid enough to bring to trial. Another powerful and cinematic theory centered on Victoria's husband, Karl Gabriel, the man who was supposed to be dead. He was reported killed in action in the trenches of France in 1914, but his body was never recovered. This sliver of uncertainty gave rise to a chilling possibility. What if he wasn't dead? Imagine a soldier, brutalized by the horrors of war, who survives and spends years making his way back home, only to find his wife in an incestuous relationship with her father, and with a child by another man. Such a discovery could certainly be a catalyst for unimaginable violence. This theory would explain the killer's rage, and perhaps even his military-like patience and planning. Some former comrades of Karl Gabriel even came forward after the murders, claiming to have seen him in Germany after the war. The idea of a ghost returning from the war to exact a terrible revenge is a potent narrative. However, there is no concrete evidence that Carl Gabriel ever returned. Most soldiers who were accounted for after the war had their records updated. The overwhelming likelihood is that he did in fact die in France. The returned husband theory remains a gripping piece of speculation, a compelling story, but one without a single piece of evidence to support it. The police cast a wide net, investigating numerous other individuals. Brothers Adolf and Anton Gump were suspected due to a supposed connection to a previous robbery in the area and a rumor that they had a relationship with Victoria. Carl and Andreas S., two brothers from a nearby town, were also investigated after one of them was linked to a similar, though less brutal, crime. A wandering journeyman carpenter who had done work at the farm and had a history of mental instability was also considered. In the 1930s, a prisoner sharing a cell with a man named Paul Muller claimed Muller confessed to the Hinterkaifeck murders. He details were plausible, but Muller had since died, and the story could not be verified. For every promising lead, there was a dead end. The police file grew thick with interviews, reports, and theories, but the central mystery remained untouched. Given the bizarre nature of the crime and the lack of a conventional suspect, it was perhaps inevitable that theories would drift into the realm of the paranormal. The previous maid's testimony about the house being haunted took on a new, sinister significance. She spoke of footsteps, voices, and an oppressive feeling of being watched. Were these the early signs of a supernatural malevolence attached to the farm itself? Perhaps the evil at Hinterkaifeck was not a person, but a place. This theory posits that the farm, tainted by the sin of incest and the dark, secretive nature of its inhabitants, became a focal point for a malevolent entity. The footsteps in the snow that didn't lead away, the noises in the attic from an unseen source, these could be interpreted as the actions of a non-human entity. While this explanation lies outside the realm of traditional criminal investigation, it speaks to the profound sense of the uncanny that surrounds the case. When human logic fails to provide an answer, the human mind often turns to the supernatural to explain the inexplicable. The idea of a haunted farm is less a serious criminal theory and more a reflection of the crime's psychological impact. The events at Hinterkaifeck were so far outside the bounds of normal human cruelty that they felt like the work of something other. Ultimately, each theory is a small boat set adrift on a vast ocean of uncertainty. The Lorenz Schlittenbauer theory provides a clear, local motive but struggles to explain the methodical nature of the crime and the killer's extended stay. The Carl Gabriel theory offers a powerful dramatic motive, but is based on the highly unlikely premise of his survival and return. The theories involving Vagrant, S. or other criminals fail to account for the lack of robbery and the intimate personal nature of the slaughter. And the paranormal theories, while capturing the eerie atmosphere of the case, offer no practical answers. The killer of Hinterkaifeck remains a perfect cipher. He is a composite ghost, a figure who could be a jealous neighbor, a vengeful husband, a wandering psychopath, or something even stranger. He left behind just enough clues to create a multitude of stories, but not enough to confirm a single one. This is perhaps the most enduring and terrifying aspect of the mystery. The killer was not a monster from a faraway land. He was, in all likelihood, a man who walked the same roads, drank in the same taverns, and breathed the same Bavarian air as his victims. He was one of them, and he got away with it, completely. A place where a great tragedy has occurred can never truly be healed. The memory of the event seeps into the soil, stains the trees, and lingers in the air like a perpetual winter chill. So it was with Hinterkaifeck. After the bodies were removed and the initial chaotic investigation wound down, the farmstead itself became an object of intense fascination and fear. It was no longer just a collection of buildings. It was a monument to an unsolved atrocity, a wound on the landscape that refused to close. The village of Kaifeck and the surrounding area were forever changed. The murders became the defining event of their history, a dark folktale come to life. The legacy of Hinterkaifeck is not just that of an unsolved crime, but of the long, creeping shadow it cast over the community for generations. In the immediate aftermath, the farm stood empty and silent, a constant, grim reminder of what had happened. The cattle and other livestock were sold off. The family's belongings were auctioned. But the house and barn remained. People were afraid to go near it, especially after dark. It became a place of morbid pilgrimage, with curious onlookers traveling from miles around to stare at the place where the 6 members of the Gruber family had been so brutally dispatched. It was also a place of ghost stories. Locals claimed to hear strange noises coming from the empty buildings at night, the sound of crying, the echo of footsteps, the ghostly clang of a pickaxe. The farm, which the former maid had claimed was haunted even before the murders, now became a place of true, unadulterated terror in the local imagination. The evil that had visited Hinterkaifeck, it was said, had never truly left. Less than a year after the murders, in 1923, the decision was made to demolish the entire farmstead. It was an act of communal cleansing, an attempt to erase the physical scar from the landscape. A team of men arrived and, piece by piece, tore down the house, the barn, the stables, and the sheds. They dismantled the walls that had witnessed the slaughter, tore up the floorboards that had been soaked in blood, and collapsed the roof of the attic that had hidden a patient killer. They filled in the cellar and leveled the ground. But you cannot demolish a memory. The act of destruction intended to bring closure, instead transformed the site into something even more mythic. Where once there was a tangible, frightening place, there was now a haunted void. An empty field where nothing would grow but grass and wildflowers. The demolition ensured that the farm would live on forever in the imagination. A ghost place that could be endlessly rebuilt in the minds of those who heard its story. The mystery continued to haunt the living as well. The individuals who had been named as suspects, particularly Lorenz Schlittenbauer, lived the rest of their lives under a cloud of suspicion. Every whispered conversation, every sideways glance in the village, was a reminder of the unsolved crime. The murders created deep divisions within the small community. Families took sides, friendships were broken, and a current of paranoia and distrust ran beneath the surface of daily life for decades. The children who grew up in the area were told the story of Hinterkaifeck as a cautionary tale, a brutal lesson in the darkness that can hide behind a neighbor's friendly face. The case became a part of the local identity, a shared trauma that was passed down from parent to child. The official investigation never truly closed, but it languished for decades. The case was reopened several times, in 1955, and again as recently as 2007, when students at a German police academy applied modern forensic techniques and criminal profiling to the cold case files. They analyzed the evidence, re-interviewed the descendants of witnesses, and constructed new psychological profiles of the killer. But even with the benefit of nearly a century of advancements in criminology, they came to the same frustrating conclusion as the original investigators. They concluded that too much time had passed, the evidence was too contaminated, and the original mistakes in the investigation were too great to overcome. They did, however, identify a primary suspect, though they did not release the name out of respect for living relatives. Most researchers believe this unnamed suspect was Lorenz Schlittenbauer, confirming that the shadow of suspicion had fallen in the right place, even if it could never be proven in a court of law. Their final report concluded with a sobering statement. The case was, and would likely forever remain, unsolvable. Today, the site of Hinterkaifeck is nothing more than an open field. The forest has crept back in, reclaiming some of the land. A small, simple shrine was erected there, a memorial to the 6 victims: Andreas, Cecilia, Victoria, young Cecilia, baby Joseph, and the maid, Maria. It is a quiet, somber place. Visitors who make the pilgrimage there speak of a strange and heavy atmosphere, a palpable sense of sorrow that clings to the air. The story has taken on a life of its own, becoming a cornerstone of true crime lore, a perfect unsolved mystery that continues to fascinate and horrify. It has been the subject of books, documentaries, and even a feature film. The name Hinterkaifeck has become synonymous with the idea of ultimate, inexplicable evil. The farm's dark legacy is its own persistence. The killer may have died long ago, taking his secret to the grave, but the questions he left behind are immortal. They linger over that empty field in Bavaria, a silent testament to a night of horror that has never truly ended. The physical farm is gone, but the ghost of Hinterkaifeck, and the terror it represents, is more permanent than any stone or timber. And so we find ourselves back where we started, in the quiet of your room, with the glow of this screen holding the darkness at bay. We have walked the lonely path to the farm behind the wooded hill. We have stood in the shadow of the barn and heard the echoes of a distant, terrible night. We have sifted through the theories, looked into the eyes of the suspects, and felt the cold, frustrating dead end of an unsolvable mystery. But what are we left with? After all the facts, all the speculation, what is the feeling that remains? It is a feeling of deep, primal unease. Because the horror of Hinterkaifeck is not just about what happened, but about what it reveals about the nature of evil itself. The story strips away our comfort, hoarding illusions about safety and security. We believe that evil has a recognizable face, the madman, the monster, the obvious villain. We believe that it comes from the outside, that it announces itself with a clear and present danger. But Hinterkaifeck teaches us a more terrifying lesson. The evil that visited the Gruber family was quiet. It was patient. It lived alongside them, in their attic and their barn, for days. It studied them. It knew their habits, their fears, their routines. It used their own tools against them. And it may have had the face of a neighbor, a friend, a lover. The story forces us to confront the chilling possibility that the greatest darkness can hide in the most mundane of places, concealed behind a familiar face and a quiet demeanor. It suggests that a monster is not a creature from a fairy tale, but a human being who has made a conscious decision to extinguish the light of empathy and compassion within themselves. Think of the killer's actions after the slaughter. The methodical tending of the livestock, the cooking of meals, the sleeping in a warm bed. This is not the behavior of a wild, rabid animal. It is the behavior of a person who is utterly devoid of a conscience, a person for whom the murder of 6 people, including a baby, is not a soul-shattering trauma, but merely a task to be completed. It represents a level of detachment and psychopathy that is profoundly disturbing. The killer of Hinterkaifeck did not just destroy a family. He erased them and then, for a short time, he became them. He was a void that walked like a man. This is the true, enduring terror of the case. It is not a ghost story about a haunted house, but a human story about the bottomless capacity for darkness within the human heart. The empty field where the farm once stood is a perfect metaphor for the mystery itself. It is a space defined by absence. An absence of answers, an absence of justice, an absence of understanding. The 6 victims, buried without their heads, represent the ultimate, unresolved nature of their own fate. They are a family torn apart, not just by the violence of the pickaxe, but by the eternal silence that followed. We will never know for certain who held that weapon. We will never know the final words that were spoken, the final thoughts of the victims. We will never understand the true motive that drove the killer to such a brutal and comprehensive act of destruction. We are left alone with the questions, and they are questions that echo in the darkest corners of our own minds. How well do we truly know the people around us? What secrets are kept behind the closed doors of our neighbors' homes? What silent, patient darkness might be watching from the edge of the woods, just beyond the circle of our own small, safe light? The story of Hinterkaifeck is a reminder that the world is not always a rational, understandable place. Sometimes the darkness wins. Sometimes there is no justice. Sometimes the only thing left in the wake of a terrible event is a profound and everlasting silence. And in that silence, if you listen closely, you can still hear the unanswered questions of what happened on that remote Bavarian farm a century ago. You can almost feel the cold, and the isolation, and the terrifying certainty that you are not alone in the house. Thank you for joining me on this journey into the heart of one of history's most chilling mysteries. Stay safe, and remember to check the locks. Not because it will always keep the evil out, but because sometimes it is the only comfort we have.